I wasn't supposed to be there. Funerals, death, burials, none of it ever sat right with me. But when my best friend Daniel died, I had no choice. It was sudden. Car accident. Just a few blocks from his house. We were supposed to meet up that night, grab a beer, talk about life like we always did. But instead, I got a call from his brother at 11 p.m. And now I was standing outside the funeral home, my palms sweaty, my mind racing. It was one of those quaint little places on the outskirts of town, Morrison and Sons Funeral Home, with the "and Sons" long faded from the sign. I don't know why, but it didn't feel like a normal funeral home. Maybe it was the way the old brick walls seemed darker than the others on the street, like they absorbed every bit of light around them. Or maybe it was the way the windows had been covered up, like they didn't want anyone seeing what went on inside. I pulled the door open, greeted by a familiar smell. Flowers, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. The inside was dimly lit, the low hum of cheap overhead lights buzzing in the distance. I signed the guest book with shaky hands and found a seat near the back. I wasn't close with Daniel's family, but I had to be here. He was my best friend. The service was fine, I guess. The usual stuff. Friends and family got up, talked about how great he was, how much they'd miss him. I tuned most of it out. My mind kept going back to the last conversation we'd had. He'd been acting strange. Really strange. I remember him telling me about some weird dreams he'd been having. Dreams about death, about what happens after. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. We'd all been a little off lately. But now, standing here, it felt like maybe I should have paid more attention. After the service, I slipped out before anyone could grab me for small talk. I hated the fake sympathy, the empty words. I just wanted to be alone. But as I was leaving, I felt a hand grab my arm. I turned around, expecting one of Daniel's family members. Instead, it was a man I'd never seen before. Tall, pale, with a tight, black suit that looked a little too formal, even for a funeral. "You're Daniel's friend," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew. "Yeah," I replied, a little thrown off. "I am. Can I help you?" He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. More like the kind you give someone when you know something they don't. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. You see, we take special care with our clients here at Morrison and Sons. Clients. The word felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "I'm sure it's fine," I said, trying to end the conversation. "I should get going." His grip tightened for a split second before he let go. "Of course. Just remember, if you ever need anything, we're always here." I nodded, not really paying attention, and quickly left. I didn't like the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a little too long. But I brushed it off. I was tired, and grief does weird things to your mind. A few days passed. Life moved on as it does, but I couldn't shake this feeling. Something wasn't right. I found myself thinking about Daniel constantly. Not just because I missed him, though I did, but because of what he'd told me before he died. I started having dreams, too. Dreams where I was in a dark room, unable to move, unable to speak. I'd hear voices around me, whispering, but I could never make out what they were saying. It felt suffocating, like something was trying to get inside my head. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had been different this time. I wasn't alone in the dark room anymore. Daniel was there, standing just a few feet from me, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a look that chilled me to the bone. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I got out of bed, pacing around my apartment, trying to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But this felt different. Too real. The next day, I decided to go back to Morrison and Sons. I told myself I just needed closure, that seeing where Daniel was buried would help me move on. But deep down, I think I knew there was more to it than that. When I arrived, the funeral home looked the same as before. Dark, quiet, unsettling. I walked around the back where the cemetery was. It was small, just a few rows of headstones, most of them old and worn. I found Daniel's grave easily. It was fresh, the dirt still unsettled. His name was carved into the stone, along with the dates of his birth and death. But something was off. The grave didn't look right. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. But then I realized the dirt. It looked like it had been disturbed. Not by animals or weather, but by something else. Something recent. My heart started to race. I crouched down, running my hand over the soil. Felt loose, like someone had been digging it up. But why? I looked around, but the cemetery was empty. No sign of anyone. No tools. Nothing. I stood up, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing by the entrance to the cemetery. It was the man from the funeral. The one in the black suit. He didn't say anything. Just stood there watching me, that same unsettling smile on his face. And in that moment I knew, whatever was happening here, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood frozen, staring at the man in the black suit as he stood perfectly still near the cemetery gate. His presence didn't just feel wrong, it felt threatening, like he knew something I didn't, and whatever it wasn't good. My instincts told me to walk away, to get out of there before I dug myself any deeper into something I didn't understand. But I couldn't leave. Not without getting some kind of answer. He continued to watch me as I made my way toward him, slow and deliberate. I expected him to say something, to stop me, but he didn't move. His gaze never left mine, a hollow expression on his face. When I finally reached him, I forced out a question, though my voice wavered. "What's going on here?" For a long moment he didn't answer, just stared at me with that unnerving grin. Finally he spoke, his voice low and smooth. "You shouldn't be here." "That's not an answer," I shot back, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I saw the grave. It's been disturbed. What are you hiding?" His smile faded slightly, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something dark and calculating. "It's not your concern. The dead rest in their own ways. Some graves aren't meant to be seen again." That cryptic reply sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step back. Daniel was my friend. I have a right to know what's happening. The man in the suit looked past me, his eyes scanning the cemetery, as if making sure no one else was around. When he finally looked back at me, his tone shifted, colder now. "Go home while you still can. Some things are best left buried." My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words, but before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing through the cemetery gates and leaving me standing there alone with nothing but questions. I should have listened to him. I should have left right then and there, but something in me wouldn't let it go. The feeling in my gut was too strong, and I couldn't shake the growing certainty that Daniel's death wasn't what it seemed. The weird dreams, the man in the suit, the disturbed grave. It all pointed to something bigger, something I didn't understand. and I couldn't just walk away from it. I crouched back down by Daniel's grave, my hands trembling as I touched the soft dirt again. The soil was loose, too loose for a freshly buried grave. As I ran my fingers through it, my hand hit something hard. My heart skipped a beat. I brushed the dirt away, revealing what looked like the corner of a wooden box. The coffin, or at least part of it. Panic rose in my chest, but curiosity won out. I glanced around the cemetery one more time, making sure the man in the suit wasn't coming back. Then, with a mix of dread and determination, I dug deeper, my hands working faster now. The more dirt I removed, the more of the coffin I uncovered. But something was wrong. I had barely uncovered the lid when I noticed it wasn't sealed properly. There was a gap, small but noticeable, between the wood and the soil. A chill ran through me. Had someone opened it? And if so, why? I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. This was insane. What was I doing? But I couldn't stop now. Not after everything I'd seen. I needed to know the truth. With a deep breath, I wedged my fingers into the gap and slowly pried the coffin open. It was empty. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Daniel's body was supposed to be here. We'd just buried him days ago. I'd been at the funeral, seen the casket lowered into the ground. But now it was empty, like he had never been buried at all. I couldn't move. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Where was his body? Who had done this? My thoughts raced in every direction, but I had no answers, just more questions. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. At first, I thought it was the man in the suit again. But it wasn't. It was someone else. A figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, half hidden in the shadows. For a split second, I thought it was Daniel. The resemblance was uncanny. Same height, same build. But when the figure stepped into the light, I realized it couldn't be him. The face was wrong, paler, gaunt, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in weeks. And the eyes, they were empty, soulless, like the person standing there wasn't alive at all. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched me, its hollow gaze fixed on mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My body refused to listen to my brain. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. I stood there, trembling, my mind racing. What the hell was that? Couldn't have been Daniel, he was dead. But the resemblance, the way it had stood there watching me, it was too real, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever I had just seen was connected to him. I knew then that I couldn't just walk away from this. Not now. Not after what I had uncovered. I needed answers. And the only place I could think to start was the funeral home. Morrison and Sons. As I left the cemetery, I felt the weight of the empty grave behind me, like a dark cloud hanging over my head. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in the cemetery. The empty grave, the figure watching me. It was all too much. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was a bad idea, I knew what I had to do next. I had to go back to Morrison and Sons. The funeral home loomed in my mind like a shadow, that strange man in the black suit lingering at the edges of every thought. There was something wrong with that place, something that went beyond just burying the dead. It felt like the kind of place that hid secrets, dark, horrible secrets. I waited until nightfall, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because it felt right, like whatever was happening there thrived in the dark. The streets were empty as I drove to the outskirts of town, the funeral home growing larger in the distance like a black mark on the landscape. When I arrived, the building was even more foreboding than I remembered. The lights inside were dim, and the windows were just as dark and shuttered as before. The sign outside, Morrison Sons, seemed to almost disappear in the shadows, as though the place didn't want to be found. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet night. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour that reminded me of blood. I stopped just outside the funeral home, staring at the heavy wooden doors, trying to gather my courage. This was insane. I shouldn't be here. But every time I thought about leaving, that image of Daniel's empty grave flashed in my mind. I needed to know the truth, no matter how deep it went. I approached the door and hesitated for a moment, expecting it to be locked. But when I pushed, it swung open with a low creak, like it had been waiting for me. The inside of Morrison Sons was eerily quiet. The dim overhead lights barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows along the floor. The smell hit me immediately, a potent mix of cleaning chemicals, stale flowers, and something much worse lurking underneath. I made my way through the main hallway, my footsteps soft on the worn carpet. I passed several closed doors, each one labeled with vague, professional-sounding names. Asterisk viewing room, asterisk preparation room, embalming suite, each one sent a chill down my spine, but I pressed on, knowing that whatever I was looking for wouldn't be out in the open. At the end of the hallway, I found a door that was slightly ajar. Unlike the others, it wasn't marked with a name, and something about it felt off. I pushed it open, stepping inside, and immediately felt a wave of cold wash over me. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a desk and some shelves, but what caught my attention was the old wooden filing cabinet against the wall. It looked ancient, its paint peeling and its drawers slightly askew, as if they hadn't been opened in years. Something told me that whatever was going on in this place, the answers were in that cabinet. I crossed the room and tugged at the top drawer. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, the metal groaning in protest before it finally gave way with a loud screech. Inside were thick, dusty folders, each labeled with names. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds. I flipped through them, my heart racing as I scanned the labels. Some were people I recognized from town, old neighbors, teachers, people who died years ago. But then I found Daniel's name. The folder was thin, much thinner than the others, like it hadn't been filled out properly. I opened it, my hands shaking, and found only a single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't a death certificate or any kind of funeral documentation. It was something else. The paper was old, yellowed around the edges, and it contained only a few lines of text, handwritten in a looping, elegant script. In death, the soul wanders. The body must rest in sacred earth, or risk becoming lost to the void. Beneath that was a signature, *James Morrison*, the original owner of the funeral home, I assumed. But there was something unsettling about the way it was written, like the ink had bled into the paper over time, leaving a stain behind. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. What the hell did it mean? Sacred earth? The void? My mind spun with questions, none of which I had answers for. But one thing was clear. Daniel wasn't resting in sacred earth. His body had been taken, and whatever had replaced him, it wasn't my friend. I stuffed the paper into my pocket and was about to close the drawer when I heard a sound. A soft creak from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone else was here. I moved to the doorway, peeking out into the hall. The funeral home was still and silent, but I could feel it, the presence of someone or something watching me. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. And then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, by the entrance to the basement, was the figure from the cemetery, the one that looked like Daniel but wasn't him. It stood there, motionless, its pale face barely visible in the dim light. Its eyes were fixed on me, empty and hollow. I backed up, my hands shaking. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. "Daniel?" I whispered, though I knew it couldn't be him. The figure's mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, I thought it might speak. But instead, it let out a low, guttural sound, like the wind howling through a graveyard. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I took another step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something I couldn't see. And then, just as the figure reached the base of the stairs, I heard another sound. A voice, deep and commanding, coming from the shadows behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around to see the man in the black suit standing in the hallway, his eyes locked on mine, his expression unreadable. Before I could say anything, he raised a hand, and the figure behind me stopped in its tracks, like it had been frozen in place. The air around us grew thick, almost suffocating, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Go home," the man said again, his voice low and dangerous. "You've seen enough. This place isn't for the living." My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "If you stay, you won't be able to leave." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I bolted for the exit. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. As I stumbled to my car, gasping for breath, I knew one thing for certain. Morrison Sons wasn't just a funeral home. It was something much, much worse. For days, I couldn't shake the events of that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. Daniel or whatever it was, standing at the edge of the hallway, staring at me with those hollow, soulless eyes. And the man in the black suit. His words echoed in my mind, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I hadn't told anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? They'd say I was crazy, that I was grieving and my mind was playing tricks on me. Hell, maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was just seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I stayed away from the funeral home, but I couldn't stay away from Daniel's grave. Every night, I found myself driving to the cemetery, sitting in my car, staring at the spot where his headstone stood. I never went inside, though. I couldn't bring myself to face the empty grave again. On the fifth night, as I sat there in the darkness, I noticed something strange. A light. It was faint, barely visible through the trees that lined the cemetery. But it was there, flickering like a lantern. It wasn't coming from the cemetery, it was coming from beyond it, somewhere in the woods. Curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't heard anything about construction or any kind of work being done in the area. What would anyone be doing out there in the middle of the night? I got out of the car and started walking toward the light. The air was cool, the grass damp beneath my feet as I made my way past the cemetery fence and into the woods. The light grew brighter as I got closer, but it wasn't steady. It flickered like firelight, but too controlled to be a campfire. As I pushed through the underbrush, I saw it. A small clearing, hidden deep in the woods, and in the center of it, a fire pit surrounded by a circle of stones. Standing around the fire were 3 figures, their backs to me. They were dressed in dark, hooded robes, their faces obscured by the shadows. I crouched down behind a tree, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was this? A ritual? A cult? I watched, holding my breath, as the figures moved in unison, raising their arms toward the fire, chanting in low voices. The words were in a language I didn't recognize. Something old, something that sent chills down my spine. And then I saw it. Lying on the ground in front of them, illuminated by the firelight, was a coffin. My blood ran cold. The coffin was old, its wood cracked and rotting, but there was no mistaking what it was. I watched as the figures circled around it, their voices growing louder, more urgent. One of them reached down and placed a hand on the coffin, their fingers tracing a symbol on the lid, an intricate looping pattern that glowed faintly in the firelight. I felt a sudden surge of nausea, like the air around me had thickened, pressing down on my chest. My instinct was to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene in front of me. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and then, without warning, the lid of the coffin began to move. It creaked open slowly, like something inside was pushing against it, struggling to get out. I wanted to scream, to do something, but my voice was stuck in my throat, my limbs frozen in place. As the lid lifted, a figure emerged from the coffin, its movements slow and unnatural. It was Daniel, or at least it looked like him. The same height, the same build. But there was something horribly wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were the same hollow, lifeless eyes I had seen before in the cemetery. He moved with a stiffness, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The hooded figures stepped back, their chanting softening into a low murmur as they watched Daniel rise from the coffin. One of them reached into their robe and pulled out a small silver knife. They handed it to Daniel, who took it in his pale, shaking hand. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew I had to stop it. My body finally responded to the adrenaline surging through me, and I lunged out from behind the tree, rushing toward the clearing. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and anger. The hooded figures turned toward me in unison, their faces still hidden in shadow. Daniel, or the thing that looked like him, turned as well, his empty eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the clearing. And then, one of the hooded figures stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal their face. It was the man from Morrison and Sons, the one in the black suit. "I warned you," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of menace. "You should have stayed away." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What the hell are you doing to him?" The man smiled, but it was a cold, lifeless smile. "We're giving him what he wanted, what they all want, to escape death." I shook my head, unable to process what I was hearing. "That's not Daniel. That thing. It's not him." The man's smile faded. "He's more Daniel now than he was when you buried him in the ground. The dead have a way of returning, if you know how to bring them back. But they need guidance." I glanced at the other figures, their faces still hidden, their hands raised in eerie reverence. "This is sick," I spat, my anger rising. You're messing with things you don't understand. The man in the black suit stepped closer to me, his cold eyes narrowing. You don't understand, boy. This is my work. I've been doing this for generations, long before your friend met his end. The dead don't stay buried here. They become something more. I felt a wave of horror wash over me. Morrison Sons wasn't just a funeral home. It was something far darker, something ancient, twisted by whatever ritual they were performing here. What did you do to him? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. Why him? The man tilted his head, as if considering my question. Daniel had questions. Questions about death. About what comes after. We merely gave him the answers he sought. He wanted to know what it was like to come back. And now he's learning. I glanced at Daniel. Asterisk, the thing that was Daniel asterisk. Still standing there with the knife in his hand, his empty gaze fixed on me. Is that what you want? The man continued, his voice low, almost hypnotic. To know what it's like to come back? To never truly die? I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet felt like lead. No, I whispered, more to myself than to him. The man smiled again, that same cold, lifeless smile. Then you should leave while you still have the choice. The figures around the fire began to chant again, their voices rising in a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. The fire flared, casting long shadows across the clearing. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled through the woods. Branches scratched at my arms, and the cold night air bit at my skin, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. As I reached the edge of the cemetery, I glanced back one last time. The fire was still burning in the distance, the hooded figures still chanting, and the figure that looked like Daniel was still standing there, watching me with those hollow, lifeless eyes. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I slammed the door shut and sped away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I knew, deep down, that I hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever was happening at Morrison Sons, whatever they were doing to the dead, it wasn't over. It had just begun.